"Get out of my seat," the flight attendant snapped, her voice cutting through the otherwise peaceful cabin like a blade. "This is for first-class passengers only, and you don't belong here." Vanessa Clark, seated in the plush leather chair of her own private jet, did not flinch. She stared at the woman, her gaze unwavering. The attendant, oblivious to the power dynamics at play, continued to berate her. But what she didn't know was that the woman sitting before her wasn't just a passenger, she was the owner of the jet, a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire. Vanessa took a deep breath and calmly, with chilling composure, looked up. "I own this jet," she said slowly, her voice cold but filled with authority. A hush fell over the cabin. Every passenger, every crew member, felt the weight of those words. The attendant's face flushed, the shock of the revelation hitting her hard. But Vanessa didn't stop there. No shouting, no drama. Instead, she let the tension build as the flight crew, including the attendant, stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Vanessa had been humiliated by people like her before, dismissed based on her appearance, and judged by her skin color. She'd had enough. This wasn't just about the seat. This was about respect, power, and the blatant disregard for her authority in her own space. Vanessa had a plan, and it was already in motion. The moment she made eye contact with her assistant on the ground, she activated the emergency protocol. Her phone buzzed. A quiet nod was all it took. 10 minutes from now, the entire flight crew would wish they had looked twice before crossing her. If you want to see what happens next, stick around. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. The tension in the cabin was palpable as Vanessa sat back in her seat, eyes fixed on the flight attendant, who stood there, her hands trembling. The rest of the flight crew, all of whom had witnessed the confrontation, were suddenly aware of the shift in the power dynamic. Vanessa could see the disbelief in the flight attendant's eyes, but she wasn't interested in explaining herself. The power was already in her hands, and she wasn't about to waste it on meaningless words. Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. She had been through this too many times before, reduced to a stereotype, ignored, dismissed because of the color of her skin. But now, sitting in her own private jet, with the world at her feet, she was not going to tolerate it any longer. A flight attendant had just humiliated her, and it was time for justice. But instead of reacting in anger, Vanessa chose silence. Silence was her weapon. Silence was the calm before the storm. As the attendant finally stammered, unable to come up with a response, Vanessa calmly reached for her phone. With a single tap, she activated the protocol. Everything was set in motion. Her assistant, Carla, was already on it. Vanessa had seen this coming. She had been planning this moment for years. This was the culmination of decades of discrimination, of underestimations, of being seen as less than she was. And now, here she was, the queen of the skies, in control of her fate. "Carla," Vanessa said softly into her phone, her voice steady, her words purposeful. "Start the protocol." "Understood." Carla's voice came through the phone, clear and professional. "It's live. The system is activated." Vanessa leaned back into her chair, crossing her arms. The crew had no idea what was about to happen. Within moments, the cabin crew would learn that they were no longer in charge. It was not their plane, their rules, or their flight anymore. Vanessa had owned this jet for years, but now she was about to show them just what true ownership meant. The flight attendant, still standing near the galley, was starting to realize the gravity of her mistake. The flight crew members whispered among themselves, looking nervously at one another, unsure of what to do next. They had crossed a line, and it was too late to backtrack. The realization dawned on them slowly, but by the time they fully understood, it would already be too late. Carla, from the ground, had already started pulling the necessary legal documents. She was sending them to the airline's corporate team, documenting every single misstep of the crew. This was going to be a lesson they would never forget. The attendant who had first confronted Vanessa looked over at the other flight crew members, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had made a huge mistake, but it wasn't just her job on the line now. Every single person in this cabin was about to be implicated. Vanessa's mind raced through the scenario. She had been targeted because of her appearance, because she wasn't dressed like a typical first-class passenger, because she was a woman of color. She had been mistreated on countless occasions, but this time, things were going to be different. This time, she would make sure they paid for their arrogance. The minutes seemed to stretch out, though in reality, only a few had passed. Vanessa could feel the air in the cabin change. The passengers, who had been quietly observing the interaction, were starting to shift in their seats. A few were whispering, others were staring, but all were waiting for something to happen. They could feel the tension in the air, but none of them knew what was coming. The flight attendant, whose hands were still shaking, took a step back, trying to regain her composure. She glanced nervously at her colleagues, but Vanessa's unflinching stare made her hesitate. "I'm sorry," the flight attendant said, her voice uncertain, but still dripping with an attempt at authority. Vanessa didn't respond. She wasn't interested in apologies. She wasn't interested in their excuses. This wasn't about fixing the moment. This was about making them understand who she was and what she had built. The flight attendant took another step back, clearly unsure of what to do next. Her eyes flickered toward the cockpit, but Vanessa knew they had already called ahead. The captain and the rest of the crew were well aware of the situation, and they had made their choice. They had sided with their employee, not with the person who actually owned the plane. "Get out of my seat," the flight attendant repeated, though her voice now lacked the force it once had. She was stalling, buying time in hopes that someone else would intervene. But Vanessa remained calm. She had control, and she wasn't going to give it up. "I told you," Vanessa said, her voice ice cold. "I own this jet, now get out of my way." The flight attendant, caught in her own humiliation, hesitated once more. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt as though the entire plane had come to a standstill. The passengers who had been watching, some silently, some now openly recording, were waiting for the next move. What would Vanessa do? What would the crew do? And more importantly, what would happen next? Vanessa's next words would change everything. Her calm, unshaken demeanor, despite everything, was about to deliver the most powerful blow yet. As the flight attendant turned to leave, her face flushed. Vanessa knew it was time. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout or threaten. She had something far more powerful, the truth and the control that came with it. "This isn't over," Vanessa muttered to herself, as the cabin began to settle into a tense silence. The storm was just beginning to brew. The flight attendant turned and walked toward the front of the cabin, but not before glancing over her shoulder, the weight of her defeat written clearly on her face. She knew she had pushed Vanessa too far, but what she didn't know was that her mistake was just the beginning. As she made her way to the front, the passengers around Vanessa began to whisper, their eyes darting nervously between her and the flight crew. The atmosphere had changed, and no one seemed to know what to do next. Vanessa remained still, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes fixed on the retreating figure of the flight attendant. Her mind was already racing, calculating the next steps. She could feel the tension building. The moment was thick with anticipation. But this wasn't a game for her. This was about something bigger than herself. It was about justice, respect, and the silent power that came with owning the very space you occupied. The minutes stretched on, and the plane seemed to hold its breath. Finally, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently experiencing a minor delay. Please remain seated while we address some matters in the front cabin." The captain's voice was calm, but Vanessa could tell it was a nervous calm. He was trying to regain control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. What they didn't realize was that the situation had already escalated beyond their control. This was no longer just about a seat. It was about authority, about being underestimated, and about a system that had failed time and time again. Vanessa could feel the shift. The captain's voice didn't reassure anyone. It only heightened the sense of uncertainty. The passengers around her were beginning to murmur, and Vanessa's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Carla. "Everything's set. The corporate team has been alerted, and I'm starting the audit now. I'll keep you updated." Vanessa's lips curled into a faint smile. She wasn't done yet. As the flight attendant returned to the cabin, her expression was one of uncertainty and discomfort. She glanced briefly at Vanessa, but quickly turned away. Vanessa could see the fear in her eyes now. Fear of the unknown, of what might happen next. But what the flight attendant didn't know was that the real storm was only just beginning. The crew had made a fatal error. They had assumed that Vanessa was just another passenger, someone they could push around. But they were wrong, and they would soon learn the consequences of underestimating her. Vanessa wasn't going to shout. She wasn't going to make a scene. Instead, she was going to let the system take care of it. With one more tap on her phone, she initiated the next phase of her plan. The flight crew was about to be hit with a reality they weren't ready for. As the cabin settled into an uneasy silence, the passengers were on edge, waiting for what would happen next. Vanessa could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, and while some looked curious, others seemed to sense that something big was about to happen. It wasn't just the passengers who were watching. The crew was waiting too, watching each other nervously. They knew the situation was spiraling out of control, and they were all afraid of what might come next. But none of them could have predicted what would happen when Vanessa's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't just Carla. It was the corporate legal team. The message was short, but clear. We're pulling all the records. All personnel involved in this incident are being investigated. Prepare for full legal escalation. Vanessa could almost feel the shock ripple through the cabin, even though no one said a word. The realization hit the flight crew first. They had no idea they were being watched, that every action they took was being logged, analyzed, and recorded. As the flight attendant who had first confronted Vanessa walked past her again, Vanessa caught her eye. The flight attendant paused, hesitated, and then looked away. She knew the game had changed. Vanessa was no longer just a passenger. She was the force that would make this situation right. Without raising her voice, Vanessa turned to the attendant and said, "You'll be hearing from my legal team soon." The words were simple, but the power behind them was undeniable. The flight attendant's face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence in the cabin deepened, and Vanessa felt a sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't about revenge, it was about principle. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She had been patient, she had stayed calm, and now she would make sure that the system corrected itself. The attendant shuffled away, and the rest of the crew exchanged nervous glances. Vanessa's phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't check it. She knew the next steps were in motion. The wheels were turning, and the entire situation was about to flip. Vanessa sat back in her seat, her expression unwavering, as the flight crew moved with increasing anxiety. She wasn't concerned. She knew the truth, and she knew that soon enough, they would all know it too. There was no turning back now. They had made their mistake, and soon they would face the consequences. As the minutes ticked by, Vanessa watched the crew, her mind sharp, her gaze never leaving them. They thought they could intimidate her, push her around, and make her feel small. But she had the last word, and the moment was coming when she would make it count. As the plane continued its flight, the tension in the cabin remained thick. Vanessa sat still, her eyes watching the flight crew as they moved anxiously around the cabin. The once composed staff now seemed unsure, their movements slow and deliberate, as though every step they took carried the weight of their mistakes. Vanessa could feel the unease spreading through the crew like a virus. They were no longer the ones in control. They were merely waiting for the inevitable. The hours seemed to drag on, but Vanessa's calm remained unshaken. She had been through this kind of thing before being underestimated, dismissed, and now, in her own quiet, calculated way, she was taking her power back. The overhead lights flickered slightly, and the hum of the plane's engines provided a steady backdrop to the uneasy silence. The passengers, though silent, were all keenly aware of the undercurrent of tension. Many of them had witnessed the confrontation, and now they could sense something far more significant was unfolding. Some of them were recording, others whispered among themselves, while a few just stared at Vanessa, waiting for her next move. Vanessa remained composed, but in her mind, she was already steps ahead. She had activated the corporate protocols. Her assistant Carla had already submitted the legal documents, and the investigation was underway. The crew, still oblivious to the full extent of the situation, had no idea they were about to be caught in a web they couldn't escape. They had crossed a line, and there would be no getting out of it. As the minutes passed, Vanessa's phone buzzed again. Carla's name appeared on the screen, and Vanessa answered the call without hesitation. "It's all set. We've got the audit logs, all the evidence we need," Carla said. Her voice was steady, professional, but Vanessa could hear the hint of satisfaction beneath the surface. "The corporate team has already been alerted, and I've escalated the matter to the legal department. This will go through the proper channels, but they will be held accountable." Vanessa nodded to herself. She had seen this coming, and now the pieces were falling into place. Her legal team would handle everything from here. The crew's actions had been logged, the evidence compiled, and there was nothing they could do to change it. The sense of control was intoxicating, but Vanessa remained grounded. This wasn't about feeling good or seeking revenge, this was about justice. The silence in the cabin deepened as the flight attendant who had confronted her earlier came back into the area. This time, she didn't make eye contact with Vanessa. Her face was pale, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She had realized, too late, that she had crossed the wrong person. The flight attendant's hands were shaking slightly as she moved past Vanessa, her eyes downcast. She had no words left. Vanessa looked at her, but she didn't say anything. There was nothing to be said. The flight attendant knew she had failed, and Vanessa's silence was the final judgment. As the flight crew moved through the cabin, Vanessa couldn't help but notice the growing discomfort on their faces. They knew that their actions had consequences, and they could feel the weight of their mistakes bearing down on them. The tension was palpable, but it was also clear that the tables had turned. Vanessa had taken control without raising her voice, without any drama. She had simply let the system work. The moment the flight crew had tried to dismiss her, they had underestimated the power she held. She wasn't just a passenger, she was the embodiment of authority and respect. As the minutes passed, Vanessa's calmness seemed to settle over the cabin like a blanket. The passengers, once nervous and unsure, now seemed to find a sense of solidarity. They had witnessed the unfolding drama, and now they knew they were part of something bigger. They were witnesses to a moment of true power, quiet, controlled, and unshakable. Vanessa looked around the cabin, her gaze lingering on the passengers who had watched the events unfold. They were all looking at her now, not with judgment, but with respect. This wasn't about the conflict with the flight crew anymore. This was about something deeper, something more profound. Vanessa had shown them what it meant to stand up for yourself, to claim your space, and to never let anyone make you feel small. As the plane continued on its flight, Vanessa's mind shifted focus once more. The legal team would handle the fallout from this incident, but she wasn't finished. She still had work to do. This wasn't just a matter of a flight being delayed or a confrontation in the air. This was a statement. This was her way of ensuring that no one, no matter their role or their assumptions, would ever treat her as less than she was. She wasn't just the CEO of a billion-dollar company. She was a force to be reckoned with. And as the plane descended toward its destination, Vanessa felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because she had won, but because she had shown the world that power wasn't just about wealth or influence. True power was about standing firm in the face of adversity, about making sure that your presence was never questioned again. The plane touched down, the wheels hitting the tarmac with a soft thud. Vanessa stood up, adjusted her jacket, and walked toward the door. She didn't need to say anything more. Her actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. As she exited the plane, she could hear the murmurs of the passengers behind her. They had all seen what had just happened, and they would never forget it. Vanessa didn't look back. She had made her statement. The world would now know that she would never be underestimated again. The moment Vanessa stepped off the plane and into the airport terminal, she could feel the weight of the situation lift, but only slightly. The fight had been won, but the war was still ahead. Her phone buzzed almost immediately as she made her way through the terminal, the soft sound breaking through the otherwise silent, tense atmosphere that had followed her since the plane touched down. She glanced at her screen. Another update from Carla. All personnel involved have been flagged. Legal is coordinating with human resources to make sure this is handled correctly. We've got the full backing from corporate. Vanessa paused in the middle of the terminal, standing still for a moment to absorb the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about her personal experience with discrimination on a plane. This was bigger. The airline had just made a mistake that would ripple through its entire organization. They had underestimated her, but more importantly, they had underestimated the power of technology and the corporate structures that supported her. The moment they crossed the line, they had unwittingly triggered a response from the system that they couldn't stop. Vanessa's gaze wandered over the busy terminal, the hustle and bustle of the airport, a sharp contrast to the intensity of what she had just experienced. People moved quickly around her, oblivious to the storm she had just weathered. A small part of her smiled. The world would never know what had just happened, not in this moment anyway. But she would. She would carry this victory with her. As she walked to the lounge to await her next flight, she reflected on the events. She had shown them all something important. She had shown them that power was not just in wealth, it was in ownership, in control, and most importantly, in silence. The silence she had maintained throughout the confrontation on the plane was her strongest weapon. By not reacting in anger, by not giving in to the emotional turbulence of the situation, she had taken back control. Vanessa's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an update from the corporate legal team. The investigation is moving forward faster than expected. The flight attendant's actions have been flagged and will be escalated. Rest assured, the airline is making it clear that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. All of her previous incidents are being reviewed, and this one is at the top of the list. Vanessa's smile grew wider as she read the message. She wasn't just getting justice for herself. She was creating change. She was making sure this never happened again, not just to her, but to anyone else who found themselves in the same situation. The power of the moment wasn't lost on her. She had been a victim of racism and discrimination countless times, but this time, she had made them see her, and not just as a black woman, but as a force to be reckoned with. It was clear now that no one would dismiss her again. As she sat down in the lounge, the noise of the terminal fading around her, Vanessa thought about how different this moment was from so many others in her life. She had worked her way up from nothing, always fighting, always proving herself, but never in a way that anyone could ignore. She had always been seen as an outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone who had to fight twice as hard to earn half as much. But now she was the one who would dictate the terms. The fight for respect was far from over, but today, she had won. And as she settled into her seat, waiting for her next flight, Vanessa knew this was only the beginning. She would continue to fight, continue to build, and continue to make sure that the world knew that she would not be silenced. Not now, not ever. The airport around her bustled with activity, but Vanessa sat still, knowing that she had just rewritten the rules for herself and for others like her. The airline had no idea what was coming. They would soon realize that crossing her had not only been a mistake, it had been a game changer. She wasn't just a CEO, she was a movement. The world had just witnessed a small victory, but in her mind, it was the beginning of something much larger. The people who thought they could silence her, they would be the ones who learned to listen. And the ones who thought they could control the system, they would soon realize they were merely playing a game that she had already mastered. Vanessa's phone buzzed again, but this time it was a message she had been waiting for. The flight attendant has been placed on administrative leave. HR is moving quickly, and the investigation will continue. Legal is reviewing the entire situation. We are behind you 100%. A sense of satisfaction washed over her as she read the message. This was exactly what she wanted. Accountability. Not just for the flight attendant, but for the entire system that had allowed this kind of treatment to continue unchecked for so long. She wasn't just seeking justice for herself anymore, she was dismantling the mechanisms that allowed others to treat people like her as invisible. Her next flight was boarding, but Vanessa stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the weight of the situation settle in. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, but it didn't faze her. They had all witnessed what had just happened, and though most of them would never fully understand the depth of it, they would remember the quiet power she had shown. The silence had spoken volumes. The cabin filled with the usual noise of passengers settling in, the overhead bins being closed, the hum of the air conditioning. But Vanessa's mind was already in motion. She had proven her point, but she wasn't finished. She had changed the course of her own story, but this was just one battle in a much larger war. As the plane ascended, she looked out the window. The vast sky before her, a reminder of just how much ground she had covered, and how much was still left to conquer. The flight was long, but Vanessa's thoughts remained clear. This wasn't just about the small, personal victory she had just claimed. It was about something much bigger. It was about showing the world that people like her would no longer be silenced or pushed aside. Her influence was growing, and now, the very systems that had long been stacked against her were beginning to shift. Her phone buzzed once more. It was an update from Carla. The CEO of the airline wants to personally apologize. They're setting up a meeting for tomorrow. Legal will be present to discuss the full scope of this issue. This isn't just about one employee anymore. The higher-ups are involved. Vanessa didn't need to respond immediately. She knew that this was a pivotal moment. The higher-ups had heard about what happened, and they were already scrambling to fix the situation. They hadn't anticipated a backlash like this, and they certainly hadn't expected it from someone like her. She wasn't the type to scream and shout, but she had a way of making sure the people who needed to hear her did. Vanessa smiled slightly to herself. It wasn't about getting a personal apology. It was about ensuring that this wasn't just a one-off incident. She wanted systemic change. She wanted an acknowledgement that what had happened wasn't just a mistake, it was a symptom of a much larger issue. And she was going to make sure the airline took responsibility for that. As the flight continued, Vanessa's thoughts turned to her next steps. This wasn't going to end with an apology or a token gesture from the airline. She was going to keep pushing, keep fighting. It wasn't about making a spectacle. It was about creating lasting change, the kind of change that would make it impossible for anyone else to be treated the way she had been. She had been quiet, patient, and calculated. Now, she was ready to take the next steps. The plane descended toward its destination, and Vanessa felt the familiar rush of anticipation that always came before an important meeting. This was it. This was her chance to make sure that the airline, and every company like it, knew that treating someone based on their appearance, their race, or their gender was no longer acceptable. When the plane finally touched down, Vanessa gathered her things and stood up, ready to face whatever came next. She didn't need to make a grand statement, because her presence alone was enough. As she exited the plane, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her again, but this time, there was a quiet respect in their gaze. They had all seen her strength. They had all witnessed the quiet power she had exerted, and they knew she was someone who wouldn't be overlooked again. This was only the beginning. The world had just witnessed a small part of what she was capable of, and now, there was no turning back. Vanessa knew that the ripple effect of this incident would continue to grow, and she was ready to ride that wave of change all the way to the top. No longer would she allow herself or anyone else to be dismissed, pushed aside, or underestimated. She had proven that power wasn't about being loud or aggressive. It was about being steady, being true to yourself, and knowing exactly when to stand your ground. And she had done that today. Vanessa Clark was no longer just a CEO. She was a force to be reckoned with, and the world was about to feel the full force of her influence. Vanessa stepped into the conference room the next morning, the sunlight pouring through the windows, casting a soft glow on the polished wood table. The room was quiet, and as she took her seat, she felt the weight of the moment settle on her. This wasn't just another business meeting. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for. The airline's executives were seated around the table, their faces a mixture of nervousness and professionalism. They had all heard the stories by now, the confrontation on the plane, the public outcry, and the internal investigation that had followed. Vanessa was here to make sure this wasn't just a fleeting moment of controversy. She was here to make them understand that what had happened wasn't just about one rude flight attendant or one bad experience. It was about something much bigger, about accountability, about respect, and about the responsibility companies like this one had to the people they served. As the meeting began, the airline's CEO, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a well-tailored suit, cleared his throat. He spoke carefully, trying to strike a balance between being apologetic and defensive. "Miss Clark," he began, "we want to sincerely apologize for the incident that occurred on our flight. It's not in line with the standards we set for our employees or the service we strive to provide." Vanessa listened, but she wasn't interested in empty words. She had heard apologies before, hollow and meaningless. She wasn't here to listen to apologies. She was here to make sure this moment meant something. "I appreciate your apology," she said calmly. "But this isn't just about the incident with the flight attendant. This is about a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. It's about the culture within your organization, about the way people who look like me are treated. And that needs to change, not just with a few disciplinary actions, but with real, tangible steps." The CEO shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Vanessa could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't going to go the way he expected. He was about to learn that apologizing wasn't enough. "Of course," he said, trying to regain some control of the conversation. "We are already taking steps to address this with the crew involved, and we will ensure this kind of behavior is never repeated." Vanessa shook her head slightly. "That's not enough. You need to create a culture of respect and inclusion at every level of your company. This goes beyond just a few bad apples. This is about a deeper issue that has been ingrained in your organization. If you're truly committed to making this right, you need to invest in diversity training, in creating policies that protect people, not just when it's convenient, but every single day. And I want to see your company take a leadership role in holding the airline industry accountable for this kind of behavior." The room was silent for a moment as her words hung in the air. Vanessa didn't flinch. She wasn't here to make friends. She wasn't here to make compromises. She was here to make sure they understood that this wasn't just a conversation. This was a movement. The CEO opened his mouth to speak, but Vanessa raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not interested in hearing more about how you plan to handle it behind closed doors," she said, her voice firm. "I want to see public action. I want you to use your platform, your influence, to make real, lasting change in this industry. Because if you don't, I can assure you, the world will see through your empty promises, and I will make sure of that." The CEO's face turned a shade of red as he realized just how serious Vanessa was. He wasn't used to this kind of pressure. He wasn't used to being held accountable like this. But Vanessa wasn't backing down. She knew this was her moment. This was her chance to make sure the world saw the truth, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. "We understand," the CEO said finally, his voice tight. "We'll do whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen again." Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm glad to hear that, but words are cheap. Show me the actions and I'll believe it." The meeting continued, but Vanessa's mind was already moving ahead. She knew this wouldn't be the end. This wasn't just about holding one airline accountable. This was about changing an entire system. She could feel the shift starting, and she was determined to ride that momentum. The executives at the table didn't realize it yet, but their world was about to be turned upside down. Vanessa wasn't just an executive with a powerful company, she was becoming a force for change. As the meeting came to a close, the CEO stood and extended his hand toward Vanessa. "Thank you for your time, Miss Clark," he said, his voice still somewhat strained. Vanessa didn't take his hand immediately. Instead, she looked him in the eye and said, "I'm not here for thanks. I'm here for change. If you're serious about that, you'll follow through. If not, I'll make sure you hear from me again. And believe me, you won't want that." The CEO's hand slowly lowered as Vanessa turned and walked out of the room. She didn't need to say anything more. She knew what she had to do, and she knew that the journey she had started was far from over. This wasn't just one small victory. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The world was about to change, and Vanessa Clark was going to make sure it did. Days passed, and the tension that had gripped Vanessa during her meeting with the airline executives seemed to lift, but the work was far from over. As the corporate response began to take shape, Vanessa found herself facing a new challenge, making sure the rest of the world knew this wasn't just about her, but about a larger movement. She knew that the real battle wasn't just winning one conversation or taking down one flight attendant. It was about changing the entire system that allowed this kind of discrimination to persist. Vanessa's phone had been buzzing nonstop with updates from her legal team, Carla, and even some of the passengers who had witnessed the incident. Everyone seemed to be rallying behind her. She had become a symbol of quiet strength, the kind of leader who didn't need to yell to be heard. But the real question was how far this could go. How could she turn this momentum into something that could change the world? She had already proven that power wasn't about wealth, it was about influence, integrity, and using your platform for good. But the next step was going to require more than just corporate pressure. It would require the public to see that this wasn't just a one-off incident. It was a systemic issue that affected millions of people, particularly people of color, who had been subject to similar mistreatment and disrespect for years. Vanessa knew that this wasn't going to be easy. She wasn't just fighting a corporation. She was fighting an entire cultural framework that had allowed people to believe they could treat others as less than human because of their race, their gender, or their appearance. But this time, Vanessa wasn't going to be silent. She wasn't going to stand by and let things continue as they had. She was going to be the catalyst for change, whether the world was ready for it or not. As Vanessa sat in her office, reviewing the final draft of her public statement, she thought about everything she had been through to get to this point. The countless hours spent building her empire, the late nights when no one believed in her, the endless battles against discrimination that were always dismissed as isolated incidents. But this time, the world was watching, and this time, things were going to be different. She clicked send on the email, releasing her statement to the press. "This is not just about one flight attendant or one incident," it read. "This is about a culture of discrimination that has gone unchecked for far too long. It is time for the systems that allow this to persist to be held accountable. I am not just speaking for myself. I am speaking for the millions of people who have been silenced, who have been dismissed, and who have been told they don't belong. This is about all of us, and we will not be silent anymore." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the surface of her desk. She had done it. She had taken the first step in turning this moment into a movement. Now, it was time to watch it spread. The media response was immediate. News outlets picked up her statement, and soon the hashtag number "We Will Not Be Silent" began trending across social media. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of discrimination, of being ignored or dismissed because of their race, their gender, or their appearance. It was a flood of voices, each one adding to the chorus of change that Vanessa had ignited. But it wasn't just the public that was paying attention. The airline, caught in the crossfire, had no choice but to respond. A statement from the CEO was released within hours, apologizing once again for the incident and promising to take stronger action against discrimination within the company. But Vanessa wasn't interested in their empty words. She had already made it clear that this wasn't about apologies. This was about real change, about a systemic overhaul, and she wasn't going to let anyone get away with simply talking about it. She wanted to see action. The public backlash against the airline was swift and unforgiving. Customers began canceling their flights, many taking to social media to share their disgust. It was clear that this wasn't just about Vanessa anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been discriminated against. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And now, there was no turning back. Vanessa watched the events unfold from her office, feeling a quiet sense of triumph. But it wasn't over. This was just the beginning. She knew that the fight for equality, for respect, and for justice was never easy. It was a long, difficult battle. But this time, she was ready for it. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been told they weren't enough. For every person who had been made to feel small, insignificant, or invisible. Vanessa Clark was ready to take on the world, and she was going to make sure they knew it. The media storm had reached its peak. Vanessa could feel the weight of the movement behind her as it continued to spread like wildfire. News outlets, influencers, and ordinary people alike had picked up the message, and soon the hashtag number "We Will Not Be Silent" had become a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, anyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed. The voices of thousands were now rising together, and Vanessa was at the center of it all. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about a collective effort to make sure that the systems which perpetuated discrimination would finally be held accountable. But even as the wave of support grew, Vanessa knew the real work had just begun. The world was listening, yes, but listening was only the first step. The question now was whether anyone would actually take action. She had ignited the fire, but now it was time to make sure it turned into lasting change. As she sat in her office, reviewing the latest press coverage, Vanessa's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unexpected call. She answered the phone without hesitation. "Vanessa," the voice on the other end said. It was Carla, her trusted assistant. "The CEO of the airline wants to meet with you. In person. He's asking for a private meeting tomorrow. He says they're ready to discuss real steps toward change." Vanessa sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The airline's CEO, the same person who had apologized so publicly, was now asking for a meeting. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but she knew that this wasn't a simple opportunity to hear more empty words. It was a chance to push for real, tangible change. If the airline wanted to prove they were serious, they needed to come to the table with a plan. Vanessa had no intention of accepting anything less than full accountability, full transparency, and full commitment to reform. "Set it up," Vanessa said, her voice steady and firm. "But make it clear this is not a conversation about better customer service or new policies. This is about a complete cultural shift. I want to see actionable steps, not just talk." Carla didn't hesitate. "Understood. I'll make sure they know exactly what you expect." As the meeting day approached, Vanessa prepared herself. She knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about holding one airline accountable. It was about setting a precedent for the entire industry, and perhaps even for corporations beyond it. The fight for equality was never easy, but Vanessa was used to fighting uphill battles. She'd been fighting her entire life. As the time for the meeting drew near, Vanessa felt a surge of determination. She wasn't going to let anyone off the hook. She wasn't going to settle for half measures or empty promises. This was the time to be bold, to demand that things actually change, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or belittled. The day of the meeting arrived, and Vanessa walked into the office with her head held high. The airline's CEO was waiting for her, his expression a mix of anticipation and caution. Vanessa wasted no time with pleasantries. "I want to make one thing clear," she began. "This isn't about apologizing again. This isn't about public relations or smoothing things over. This is about dismantling the systems that allow discrimination to thrive. This is about making sure that your company is a place where people of all backgrounds, all appearances, and all races feel like they belong." The CEO nodded slowly, trying to meet her gaze, but there was an underlying nervousness there. He had clearly underestimated Vanessa's resolve. "Of course, we're committed to making changes," he said, his tone more careful now. "But we need to make sure we're taking the right steps. We want to build something sustainable. Sustainable change is not just about building something. It's about commitment," Vanessa shot back. "It's about making sure that your leadership and your employees are not just following a set of guidelines, but are truly invested in making this company one that values diversity and inclusion at every level. This is about creating a culture where discrimination is not tolerated in any form, whether it's in the sky, in the office, or anywhere else." The CEO paused, clearly searching for the right words, but Vanessa wasn't going to let him off the hook. "If you want my trust," she continued, "if you want anyone's trust, you need to show me, and show the world, that this isn't just a PR stunt. Show me what actions you're taking. Tell me how you plan to hold yourselves accountable." The silence that followed was heavy. Vanessa wasn't giving him an out. She wasn't asking for vague promises or superficial actions. She was asking for a plan that could be executed and measured. After a long pause, the CEO finally spoke. "We're ready to take action," he said, his voice more resolute. "We'll start by implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training at every level of the company. We will ensure that all hiring practices are examined to remove any biases, and we will create a system of accountability where employees can report discrimination without fear of retaliation. We'll be transparent about our progress, and we'll have regular audits to ensure these changes are being made." Vanessa listened carefully, but she wasn't satisfied just yet. "And what about leadership?" she asked. "Are you willing to make sure your leadership team reflects the diversity of your customers? Because it's not just about what happens on the ground or in the cabin. It's about who's making the decisions and who's making the calls at the highest levels." The CEO hesitated, but then nodded. "Yes," he said. "We will work to ensure that leadership reflects the values we're aiming to instill in the company. We will be transparent about leadership diversity and work to diversify our executive team." Vanessa allowed herself a brief nod of approval. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. She wasn't going to stop pushing, but this was the breakthrough she needed. She had forced the conversation to be real, to be grounded in action, not empty words. She stood up, extending her hand. "I'll be watching," she said firmly, "and I expect to see results." As she left the meeting, Vanessa felt the weight of the moment. This was a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or insignificant. The world was changing, and Vanessa Clark was at the forefront of it. She was done being overlooked. She was done being dismissed. And now, the world was watching. The fight for equality had begun, and Vanessa was leading the charge. Weeks passed, and the changes Vanessa had pushed for began to take shape. The airline's leadership had made public commitments to reform, but Vanessa wasn't interested in their statements. She was watching, waiting, and demanding results. She had already seen countless companies make promises, only to fall short once the spotlight faded. This time, she wasn't going to let anyone off the hook. She had started something bigger than herself. And it wasn't just about the airline anymore. It was about changing the industry, changing corporate culture, and creating an environment where people like her and millions of others could no longer be dismissed or ignored. Her legal team had kept her updated on the airline's progress, but Vanessa knew better than to take their word for it. She wasn't just relying on reports or press releases. She was paying attention to the actions, not just the words. And what she saw was progress, but she also saw room for more. The diversity and inclusion training had been rolled out across the company, and while it was a step in the right direction, Vanessa knew that training alone wasn't enough. She had spoken with employees who had gone through it, and many of them told her it felt more like a checkbox exercise than a genuine effort to change. "They're talking the talk," one employee had said, "but I don't know if they're walking the walk." Vanessa knew that true change had to come from the top. It wasn't just about training or policies, it was about creating a culture of accountability, where every employee, from the CEO to the newest hire, was held to the same standard of respect and inclusion. It was about making sure that the leadership team reflected the diversity of the communities they served. The phone call came late one afternoon. It was Carla, her trusted assistant. "Vanessa," Carla said, "I just got word. The airline's CEO wants to meet with you again. He says they're ready to discuss the next steps, and they want you to be involved in their new initiative on diversity." Vanessa's heart raced. She knew this was the moment. They had finally come to her with an opportunity to take the next step in the process, but she also knew that this could be a make-or-break moment. She had pushed them hard, and now they were asking for her involvement. "Set it up," Vanessa said, her voice calm but firm. "But make it clear this time, I want to see the real plan. I want to know exactly what they're doing, and I want to be sure that they're going to follow through." As the day of the meeting arrived, Vanessa couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. Just a few months ago, she had been a passenger on a flight, humiliated by a flight attendant who didn't even recognize her as the CEO of a billion-dollar company. But now, she was at the forefront of a movement, leading the charge for change. She had made a difference, and she wasn't about to stop now. She walked into the meeting room with confidence. The CEO and his leadership team were already seated, waiting for her. This time, the mood was different. There was no defensiveness, no hesitation. They were ready to take responsibility, and Vanessa could sense it. "Thank you for meeting with me again," the CEO said as she sat down. "We know we have a lot of work to do, and we want to make sure that we're doing it the right way. We've made some changes already, but we need your help to take it to the next level. We want you to be part of the new diversity initiative we're launching." Vanessa listened carefully, but she wasn't ready to just accept their words. She needed to see more. "I'm glad to hear that you're ready to take action," she said. "But I want to be clear. This isn't about another round of training or awareness programs. This is about real systemic change. I want to see your leadership team reflect the diversity of the people you serve. I want to see measurable goals and accountability. And most importantly, I want to see you hold yourselves accountable when you don't meet those goals." The room was silent for a moment. The CEO and his team exchanged glances, but this time, they didn't argue. They knew Vanessa was right. "We understand," the CEO said finally. "We've already started the process of restructuring our leadership team to make it more diverse. We've set specific goals for hiring and promotion, and we're committed to transparent reporting. We know it's not going to be easy, but we're ready to do the hard work." Vanessa nodded. This was what she had been waiting for. They were finally taking the right steps. "Good," she said. "But I want to make sure that this doesn't stop here. This isn't just about numbers on a page. This is about creating a culture that values diversity and inclusion at every level. I want to see action, not just talk. I want to see you holding your executives and employees to the same high standards you're setting for your customers." The CEO nodded again, his expression more serious than it had been the first time they met. "We're committed," he said. "We'll do whatever it takes." Vanessa could feel the shift in the room. This time it was different. The airline had heard her. They had heard the message, loud and clear. They were finally ready to make the changes she had been fighting for. As the meeting came to a close, Vanessa stood up and shook the CEO's hand. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "But this isn't the end. This is just the beginning. I'll be watching closely, and I expect to see the results." As she walked out of the room, Vanessa couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was the moment she had been waiting for, and it wasn't just a win for her, it was a win for everyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed. She had shown the world that one person could make a difference, and she had proven that silence could be more powerful than any loud protest. The change was coming, and Vanessa was leading the charge. Months passed, and the momentum Vanessa had ignited continued to build. The airline had made progress, but Vanessa knew that real change couldn't be rushed. It had taken decades for the systems of discrimination to become so deeply ingrained in corporate culture, and it would take just as long to dismantle them. But the difference now was that the fight was no longer a quiet one. The voices of thousands, empowered by Vanessa's actions, were speaking out, demanding the change they had been denied for so long. The hashtag number "We Will Not Be Silent" had become a symbol of resilience, and the airline was still reeling from the public scrutiny. But Vanessa wasn't focused on the headlines anymore. She wasn't interested in the praise or the attention. She was focused on what came next. She had changed the narrative, and now it was time to create a legacy. One evening, as she sat in her office, reviewing the progress of the diversity initiatives across various industries, Vanessa received a call from a well-known journalist who had been following her journey. "Vanessa," the journalist said, "your impact has been nothing short of revolutionary. People are watching what's happening at the airline and asking if it could be applied to other industries. Are you ready to speak about taking this movement nationwide?" Vanessa paused. The question was one she had anticipated for months, but she hadn't fully processed what it would mean. It wasn't just about the airline anymore. It was about every company, every institution, every organization that perpetuated a culture of discrimination. "I've spent my whole life proving myself," Vanessa said quietly, her eyes fixed on the window as the city lights twinkled in the distance. "And now I'm ready to make sure no one else has to prove themselves the way I did. I want to see change on a national scale, but I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about the people who are finally being seen, who are finally being heard." The journalist was silent for a moment, then responded, "You're talking about a nationwide initiative, a movement that extends beyond this one airline, beyond the corporate world even. This could change everything." Vanessa's heart raced as the magnitude of the situation sank in. She had started with one confrontation on a plane, but this was something far bigger. "Yes," Vanessa said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "This has to be bigger. It's time to push for systemic change in every sector. We can't just address the issue of discrimination in one industry. We have to take this fight to the streets, to the boardrooms, to the places where decisions are made. It's about creating a new standard of accountability." The journalist's voice was filled with admiration. "If you're serious about this, we could help make it happen. The media, the public, they're ready for this." Vanessa sat back in her chair, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. She had already committed herself to this fight, but now she had the chance to take it to the next level. This wasn't just about corporate reform anymore. This was about transforming society itself. "Let's make it happen," Vanessa said, her voice resolute. "I'm in. But we have to be clear about what we're doing. We're not just asking for apologies. We're not just asking for better policies. We're demanding a complete overhaul of how power is distributed, how people are treated, and how accountability is enforced." The journalist agreed. "I'll get the ball rolling," they said. "We'll need your help with strategy, with visibility, but we'll be with you every step of the way." As Vanessa ended the call, she leaned back and closed her eyes. The next phase of her journey had begun. She had already made history with the airline, but now she was poised to change the landscape of the corporate world and beyond. This was the moment she had been waiting for. It wasn't just about raising awareness anymore. It was about creating a new world, one where respect, dignity, and equality were the standard. It was time to take her fight to the national stage. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Vanessa worked with key influencers, advocacy groups, and industry leaders to craft a comprehensive plan for the movement. They organized rallies, community events, and media campaigns that highlighted the need for diversity and inclusion at every level of society. Vanessa spoke at national conferences, sharing her vision for a future where discrimination was no longer tolerated. But even as the movement gained momentum, Vanessa knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The forces that perpetuated inequality were deeply rooted, and there were many who stood to lose power if real change happened. But that didn't stop her. If anything, it made her more determined. She had fought too long and too hard to let this opportunity slip through her fingers. Vanessa's voice was no longer just her own. It had become the voice of thousands who had been silenced for too long. As the movement spread, more and more people began to share their stories. The "We Will Not Be Silent" campaign became a platform for those who had been overlooked, those who had been excluded, those who had been treated as less than. And as the stories piled up, so did the pressure on those in power to do something about it. It wasn't just the airline industry that was feeling the heat. Major corporations, schools, and even government agencies began to pay attention. They knew that they could no longer ignore the growing call for change. The movement Vanessa had started was forcing them to confront their own biases and examine their practices. It was clear that things were changing, and they were changing fast. Vanessa knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't just fighting for her own legacy anymore. She was fighting for a future where equality wasn't something that had to be fought for, it was something that was guaranteed. As the movement continued to gain ground, Vanessa's role became even more important. She had become a symbol of hope, a beacon for those who had been left behind, and a catalyst for change. And no matter how hard the fight became, she knew she would never back down. She had started this fight, and now she was going to finish it. The momentum that Vanessa had sparked continued to build, but now she was facing the kind of challenge that came with truly changing the world. The media was buzzing with excitement, but the real test was just beginning. Corporate leaders, policymakers, and influential figures were beginning to take notice. The "We Will Not Be Silent" movement had transcended the initial outcry, becoming something far more powerful, a symbol of resistance against systemic inequality. Vanessa's phone rang off the hook with calls from reporters, activists, and even government officials asking for her insight, advice, or endorsement. But she knew that the hardest part of the battle was still ahead of her. It wasn't enough to raise awareness. The world needed action, real, tangible action. The airline had made their promises, but Vanessa had no intention of letting them off the hook just yet. She had spoken to too many people who had been burned by corporate apologies that amounted to nothing. She wasn't going to let this be another empty gesture. The first step was putting pressure on other corporations, making sure that the airline wasn't the only one forced to examine their culture and practices. Vanessa knew that change wasn't going to happen overnight, but the groundwork was being laid. Her team of legal experts and advisors had already begun drafting proposals for new policies that could be implemented nationwide. Policies that would push corporations to take real steps toward inclusion and diversity. She knew this wasn't just a fight for her own industry. This was a fight that could reshape the entire corporate world. The next few months were a whirlwind of meetings, press conferences, and strategy sessions. Vanessa traveled to major cities, speaking at rallies and events, continuing to spread the message of change. She used every platform available to her to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced. Everywhere she went, the message was clear. Enough was enough. The time for change was now. As the momentum continued to build, Vanessa received an invitation to speak at a high-profile summit on diversity and inclusion hosted by the nation's leading civil rights organizations. It was a massive opportunity, a chance to reach an even wider audience and to push for the kind of systemic changes that would be needed to truly make a difference. Vanessa was determined not to waste it. The summit was held at a grand convention center in Washington, D.C., and as Vanessa stood on the stage, she felt the weight of the room's collective energy. Thousands of people had gathered to listen, all united by the same goal: equality. As she stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell silent, waiting for her to speak. Vanessa took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces. It was in moments like these that she felt the power of her voice, the power of the movement she had started. "For too long, we have been silenced," Vanessa began, her voice steady but filled with passion. "For too long, we have been told to wait our turn, to be patient, to accept the scraps that are thrown to us. But we are done waiting. We are done accepting the status quo. We are done being overlooked. We will not be silent anymore." The crowd erupted in applause, but Vanessa wasn't finished. This is not just about one incident, one airline, or one CEO. This is about a cultural shift that must take place, not just in one company, but across every single industry in this country. It's about recognizing that everyone, no matter their race, gender, background, or appearance, deserves the same opportunities, the same respect, and the same chance to succeed. But it's not enough to say we believe in equality. We must live it every day, in our policies, our hiring practices, our leadership, and our communities. It's time to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. The room was filled with energy now, a collective roar of agreement from every corner of the auditorium. Vanessa could feel the power of the movement surging through her. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been pushed to the margins, for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. "This is about more than diversity programs or sensitivity training," Vanessa continued. "This is about changing the fabric of our society, from the top down. If we truly want to make a difference, we need to ensure that every person has a seat at the table, that every voice is heard, and that we are held accountable when we fall short." As she spoke, Vanessa saw the faces of those in the audience, faces of every color, every background, every walk of life. They weren't just listening to her. They were living the reality she was describing. It was a moment of unity, of shared purpose, of collective strength. She wasn't alone in this fight. She never had been. And as the applause grew louder, Vanessa knew that this was the turning point. This was the moment that would change everything. The media coverage of the summit was widespread, and soon the "We Will Not Be Silent" movement was being discussed in every corner of the country. Corporations, politicians, and influencers were all taking notice. Vanessa's efforts were beginning to pay off. The conversation had shifted. What had started as one small act of resistance had become a national movement, and the pressure on companies to change was mounting. But Vanessa knew that the real work was still ahead. She wasn't done yet. The summit had been a powerful moment, but the movement needed to continue growing, continue pushing for change. The next phase was already taking shape in her mind: policy proposals, legal reform, and a nationwide push to make discrimination illegal in every form, across every sector. Vanessa wasn't just going to be a symbol. She was going to be the architect of the future, a future where equality wasn't just a dream but a reality for everyone. As she left the stage and walked off to the sound of applause, she couldn't help but smile. This was just the beginning. Months passed, and the momentum of Vanessa's movement continued to grow, but she knew the road ahead was not going to be easy. The "We Will Not Be Silent" campaign had started as a call for change within a single corporation, but it had quickly transformed into something larger, an undeniable force that was sweeping through industries, organizations, and communities across the nation. Vanessa had become the face of a new era, one where inequality could no longer be swept under the rug. Everywhere she went, people recognized her not just as a CEO, but as a symbol of resilience and resistance. Her phone rang constantly with calls from other business leaders, advocates, and lawmakers who were eager to align themselves with her cause. She had become a beacon for those who had been silenced for too long, and her influence was only growing. But with that influence came pressure. The more successful the movement became, the more resistance she faced from those who stood to lose power. Vanessa knew that she had made enemies along the way, but that was the price of fighting for change. She was not intimidated. She had fought too long and too hard to be silenced. As the pressure mounted, Vanessa kept her focus. The next big step in her mission was clear. She needed to bring her message to the halls of power. If she wanted real change, she would need to push for legislative reform. She needed to make sure that companies across the nation were held accountable, not just for their actions, but for their very culture. She was determined to ensure that every person, no matter their race, gender, or background, would have the same rights, the same respect, and the same opportunities to succeed. She began working with lawmakers to draft new bills that would mandate diversity and inclusion in every sector. The fight for equality had to be enshrined in law. She pushed for stricter penalties for discrimination, including fines for companies that failed to meet diversity benchmarks and tax incentives for those that went above and beyond in their efforts. Vanessa knew this was no small task, but she was ready for it. Her legal team was working tirelessly, gathering data, crafting arguments, and meeting with experts to build a case that would force lawmakers to take action. The bills were introduced in Congress, and the media quickly picked up on the story. Vanessa was in the spotlight once again, her every move watched by millions. She was speaking at rallies, giving interviews, and continuing to push for the reforms she knew were necessary. But she was not without opposition. Many of the country's largest corporations, along with their lobbyists, began to push back against the proposed legislation. They argued that the changes would be too costly, too disruptive. They warned that implementing such sweeping reforms could harm their bottom line. But Vanessa wasn't swayed. She had seen the harm that inequality had caused. She had lived through it herself. She knew the cost of doing nothing was far greater than the cost of change. The more the opposition spoke, the stronger Vanessa's resolve became. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been treated as less than, every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. Her team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, crafting counter-arguments, rallying supporters, and organizing events to push the bills forward. She wasn't just asking for change, she was demanding it. As the legislation moved through Congress, Vanessa traveled the country, speaking at town halls and engaging with communities who had been impacted by inequality. She met with workers, activists, and even students, all of whom shared their stories of how they had faced discrimination in their lives. These personal stories became the backbone of her arguments, fueling her passion and determination. When the bills finally came to a vote, it was a long, tense day in Washington. Vanessa sat in the gallery, watching as lawmakers debated. She knew the outcome was uncertain, but she wasn't about to sit back and wait. She had spent her entire life fighting for what was right, and now she was in the final round of the fight. The tension in the room was palpable. Every vote was crucial. And then, after hours of discussion, the vote came in. The bills passed. Vanessa's heart raced as the news spread like wildfire. This was a victory not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, marginalized, or dismissed. The legislation would require companies to adhere to strict diversity and inclusion standards, provide real consequences for discriminatory behavior, and promote equal opportunities across all sectors. As the applause echoed through the halls of Congress, Vanessa sat back in her seat, allowing herself a brief moment to breathe. It had taken years of hard work, countless setbacks, and immeasurable sacrifices, but she had done it. The world had changed, and this was only the beginning. As the news broke, Vanessa received congratulatory messages from all over the country, from people who had followed her journey and believed in her vision. But as she read each message, she knew this wasn't the end. This was just one step in a much longer journey. There was still more work to be done. But for the first time in a long while, Vanessa allowed herself to feel a sense of satisfaction. She had fought for equality, for justice, and for the future she believed in. And now, the world was beginning to see the fruits of that fight. The impact of the new legislation would be felt across industries, changing the way businesses operated and ensuring that diversity, equity, and inclusion were no longer just buzzwords but fundamental principles. As Vanessa looked out over the city skyline from her office, she knew that her work was far from over. The fight for equality, for justice, for respect, those were battles that would continue for years to come. But Vanessa had proven something to herself and to the world. She had proven that one person, one voice, could make a difference. And she was just getting started. As the weeks went by, the impact of Vanessa's work continued to reverberate through every corner of the country. The legislation she had fought so hard for was now law, and companies were scrambling to comply with the new standards. The business world was in a state of flux, and while many were pushing back, the vast majority were recognizing that they had no choice but to adapt. Vanessa had broken through the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable, but now she was facing the next challenge, ensuring that the changes made were sustainable and that true cultural shifts took place within these organizations. She knew that laws alone would not change hearts and minds. She needed to ensure that the momentum kept going, that the fight for diversity, equity, and inclusion would not fade into the background as so many past efforts had. The media continued to cover her work, but Vanessa was no longer concerned with the headlines. She had already proven that she could be a catalyst for change. Now, it was time to ensure that this wasn't just a moment in history, but a movement that would carry on for generations to come. The next phase of her mission was to take her message to the grassroots level, to connect with the communities that had been affected the most by systemic injustice. She knew that the fight wasn't just in the boardrooms. It was in the streets, in schools, in local businesses, and in the everyday lives of people who had long been marginalized. She began working with activists, organizations, and local leaders to develop programs that would ensure people on the ground were empowered, educated, and supported in the ongoing fight for equality. She spoke at rallies, town halls, and community meetings, connecting with people on a deeper level than ever before. It was clear that Vanessa had become the face of a revolution, and with that came both an incredible responsibility and an opportunity to shape the future in ways she had never imagined. Her role was no longer just as a business leader or a CEO. She had transcended that. She was now a movement, a force that represented every individual who had ever been denied their rightful place in society. Vanessa's efforts had already influenced corporate America, but she knew she couldn't stop there. The world was watching, and she had to make sure that every inch of progress was fought for and maintained. She began working on initiatives to ensure that younger generations were educated on the importance of diversity and inclusion, teaching them not just about policy, but about empathy, respect, and the power of listening. Schools across the nation began to adopt curriculum that focused on these critical issues, and Vanessa worked closely with educators to create tools and resources to help students navigate a world that was often hostile to those who were different. As her work expanded, Vanessa realized that her influence had spread beyond what she had ever anticipated. She was invited to speak at international forums, to represent the movement on a global scale, and she used every opportunity to remind people that the fight for equality was not just an American issue, it was a global issue. Everywhere she went, she carried with her the stories of those who had been oppressed, those who had suffered silently for far too long, and she made sure their voices were heard. The resistance she had faced from the beginning began to wane as the effects of her work became undeniable. More and more companies publicly pledged their commitment to diversity and inclusion, not just as a matter of compliance, but as a matter of ethics. The corporate world was beginning to see that embracing diversity wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the smart thing to do. And yet, even as these changes unfolded, Vanessa remained vigilant. She knew that progress was fragile, the forces of inequality and injustice were powerful, and they would never give up without a fight. But Vanessa was no longer intimidated. She had proven that one voice could change the world, and now she was determined to prove that sustained change could be built on that foundation. As she stood on the stage at the United Nations, addressing an audience of world leaders, Vanessa reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had started as an individual who refused to be overlooked, and now she was standing before the world as a leader who had sparked a global movement. "We are all connected," she said, her voice resonating through the hall. "What happens to one of us happens to all of us. The fight for equality is not about a single moment or a single victory. It is about the everyday actions we take to make the world a better place. It's about ensuring that every voice is heard, that every person is treated with dignity and respect, and that we are all given the opportunity to thrive." The applause was deafening, and as Vanessa looked out over the crowd, she realized that this was the beginning of something much bigger than herself. It wasn't just about the work she had done or the legislation she had helped pass. It was about the legacy she was leaving behind. Vanessa Clark had become a force of nature, a symbol of hope, resilience, and strength. And though the journey was far from over, she knew that she had already changed the world. The seeds had been planted, and they were beginning to grow. And no matter what came next, Vanessa would continue to fight, continue to push for a world where equality, justice, and respect were not just ideals, but the foundation on which everything else was built. The world continued to shift, and as Vanessa's efforts began to take root, the results were both profound and far-reaching. The initial success of the legislation she helped pass had sparked a ripple effect across industries, communities, and governments. But even as victories piled up, she knew this wasn't the end of the fight, it was just the beginning. Vanessa had made a name for herself as a fierce advocate for equality, and now she was being invited into spaces that she had once only dreamed of. She was a sought-after speaker at global forums, a trusted advisor to multinational corporations, and a mentor to the next generation of leaders. But with all this attention came new challenges. The same systems that had tried to silence her were now working harder than ever to maintain the status quo. The resistance had evolved. It wasn't just about corporate reluctance anymore. It was about entrenched power and a reluctance to let go of the old ways. Vanessa felt the weight of this every day. But she wasn't deterred. She had seen the power of a single voice, and now she understood the power of collective action. The movement she had started wasn't just her own, it was a global movement, and she knew that the work needed to continue. She wasn't going to let up until the culture of inequality was completely dismantled. One evening, Vanessa sat in her office, looking over reports of the changes that had taken place in the wake of her advocacy. New diversity and inclusion standards had been implemented in thousands of companies. Many businesses had begun offering paid leave for employees experiencing discrimination, harassment, or other inequalities, and workplaces across the country had begun focusing on recruitment and retention strategies that prioritized marginalized groups. But even as these changes took shape, Vanessa couldn't ignore the gaps that remained. There was still so much work to do, especially in education, healthcare, and law enforcement sectors where inequality was still rampant. Vanessa knew that changing the corporate world was only part of the equation. To make real change, she had to reach the grassroots level, to the communities that needed it most. It was clear that much of the fight for equality would have to be fought in local communities, with people organizing and pushing for policies that benefited all, not just the few. That's when Vanessa decided to take her mission into the streets. She created a new initiative, an organization dedicated to bridging the gap between corporate reform and community activism. The goal was to ensure that the momentum she had started didn't just stay within boardrooms and government offices, but that it reached the people who needed it most. The initiative focused on grassroots training, organizing local leaders, and providing resources to underrepresented communities. It worked with schools to teach children about the importance of diversity, empathy, and leadership. It provided workshops for adults on how to push for change within their own workplaces and local governments. Vanessa knew that lasting change would require more than just laws. It would require a cultural shift at every level of society. As the initiative gained traction, Vanessa traveled across the country, meeting with community leaders, educators, and activists to hear their stories and learn how best to support their efforts. Each city she visited brought new challenges, new perspectives, and new opportunities for growth. The road was long, but every step she took felt more purposeful than the last. During a trip to Detroit, Vanessa met with a group of young students at a community center. They had heard about her work, and many of them saw her as a role model, someone who had fought through adversity to get to where she was. It was in this meeting that she realized the full extent of her impact. The students, many of whom came from low-income backgrounds, had always been told that the systems they were fighting against were too strong, too entrenched to change. But when they heard her story, they saw possibility. They saw someone who had taken on the system and won, and they started to believe that they, too, could make a difference. "I want you to know," Vanessa told them, "that you are the future. You are the change that this world needs. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't have a voice. Don't let anyone tell you that your dreams are too big. Because if I can do it, you can too. The world needs you. We need your leadership, your passion, and your vision. So don't wait for permission. Go out and change the world. It's yours to take." As she spoke those words, Vanessa saw the spark of inspiration in their eyes. She knew that this wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for them, and for every person who had ever been told they couldn't succeed because of their background, their skin color, or their gender. These students weren't just learning about leadership, they were becoming the next generation of change makers. Later that evening, Vanessa received a call from one of the corporate leaders she had been working with. "Vanessa," he said, "I've been watching the work you've been doing, and I just wanted to say that it's nothing short of incredible. Your efforts are changing the way we think about diversity, and we're ready to commit to even more. We're investing in new programs, and we're going to make sure that our company's leadership reflects the diversity of the communities we serve." Vanessa felt a sense of pride. She had fought for change, and now companies were starting to walk the walk. The tide was turning, but even as she saw the positive impact of her work, she knew that the fight was not over. There were still too many people who were being left behind, too many systems that were designed to keep the status quo intact. Vanessa was determined to continue the fight for equality no matter how long it took. The journey was far from finished, but she was more committed than ever to seeing it through. One step at a time, the world was changing, and Vanessa was leading the charge. Vanessa stood at the front of the massive auditorium, her eyes scanning the crowd. It was a new chapter in her journey, and the weight of what she had achieved settled heavily on her shoulders. The room was filled with people, business leaders, activists, students, and advocates all gathered to hear her speak at the first-ever National Leadership Summit on Diversity and Inclusion. This was the culmination of years of hard work, and as Vanessa took the stage, she felt a sense of purpose unlike anything she had ever experienced before. This was no longer just about changing one company, one industry, or even one country. This was about creating a global movement, one that would last far beyond her own lifetime. As the crowd applauded, Vanessa stepped up to the microphone, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. She could feel the energy of the people around her, people who had joined her in this fight, people who had fought for years, even decades, for the same things she had: equality, justice, and the opportunity to be seen. Vanessa took a deep breath, steadied her nerves, and began. "We are at a crossroads," she said, her voice steady, but filled with passion. "The world has changed in ways that many of us couldn't have imagined just a few years ago. The fight for equality is no longer something we have to beg for. It's something that's being demanded, not just by the few, but by the many. The time for change is now, but let me tell you, this journey is far from over. It is up to all of us, every single one of us, to ensure that the progress we've made is not just temporary, but permanent." The room was silent now. every person hanging on her words. We've made great strides, Vanessa continued. But change is never easy. We are battling forces that have been in place for centuries, systems of power that were built to exclude and oppress. These systems will not go down without a fight. And that's why we need to keep pushing, keep demanding, and keep showing up. It is not enough to be complacent. It is not enough to be silent. We must act. We must rise together, as one, and demand that the world we want to live in is one of fairness, respect, and opportunity for all. The applause started again, and Vanessa paused to let the energy of the room settle. She knew that the message was resonating with everyone present, but she also knew the work was far from finished. As much as things had changed, there were still people out there who believed the status quo should remain intact. She had made powerful enemies along the way, but that didn't matter. Vanessa wasn't here to win popularity contests. She was here to change the world. The work we've started, Vanessa said, is not just for us. It's for the generations to come. It's for our children and their children, and for everyone who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. It's for the people who will never get a chance to speak for themselves, but whose voices are louder than ever because we are speaking for them. Vanessa felt the weight of her own words. She had fought for this, and now it was her responsibility to ensure that the fight continued. She couldn't do it alone. No one person could. This had to be a collective effort. It had to be something that every single person in that room, and every single person watching from around the world, took responsibility for. "I can't do this without all of you," Vanessa said, her voice breaking through the applause. "I can't do this without every one of you who is ready to stand up, to speak out, to hold those in power accountable. This fight is not just mine, it's ours. And we will continue to fight until every person, no matter where they come from, no matter the color of their skin, no matter their gender, no matter their background, has the same opportunities, the same respect, and the same dignity." The crowd erupted into applause again, but Vanessa didn't smile. Not yet. She had one more thing to say. "We've come far, but we haven't won yet," she continued. "The real work begins now. This is where we roll up our sleeves and get to work. This is where we ensure that what we've built will stand the test of time. And I promise you, I will be here every step of the way. I will be with you in this fight. And I will never back down." The room exploded in applause, the energy in the air electric, as Vanessa stepped away from the podium, her heart racing. She had delivered her message, and now the world would hear it. She wasn't just a CEO anymore. She was a leader, a visionary, a catalyst for change. The journey had been long and difficult, but as Vanessa walked off the stage, she knew that the fight for equality was just beginning. There was still so much to do, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were on the brink of something real, something that would change the world, and she would be there, at the forefront, leading the charge. Vanessa's phone buzzed late into the evening, signaling yet another meeting request. She glanced at the screen and smiled to herself. The world had changed, and she had become the person everyone wanted to hear from, the person everyone wanted on their side. The legislative victories, the corporate reforms, the educational initiatives, everything was starting to align. But as her influence grew, so did the realization that the hardest battles were yet to come. She had pushed for change on a national scale, but what she was fighting for was not just about passing laws or holding corporations accountable. It was about changing hearts and minds, one at a time. That would take years. Years of work, years of advocacy, and years of fighting for what was right. As she sat in her office, looking over the latest news about the corporate world's response to the new diversity mandates, Vanessa couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride in how far they had come. But she knew that the changes she had set in motion were fragile. Corporate leaders who had agreed to new standards were still grappling with how to implement them. There were still moments of resistance, moments when people reverted to old habits, moments when the very people who claimed to support the cause seemed to lose sight of the bigger picture. Vanessa knew that if the momentum was going to continue, it couldn't just be about forcing companies to comply. It had to be about inspiring a shift in culture. As she prepared for the upcoming meeting, she reflected on how much she had changed since this all started. Years ago, she had been focused only on her own business, on building her empire. But now, her empire was something much bigger, something that didn't just have to do with personal success, but with leaving a legacy that would last for generations. It was about making sure that every person, no matter their race, gender, or background, could walk into a room and be respected. She was no longer just a businesswoman. She was a global leader, a voice for the unheard, a reminder that change was possible if enough people stood up and demanded it. The meeting was scheduled for the following day at the United Nations, a place that Vanessa had never imagined she would be speaking in, a place that had become a symbol of international cooperation, a place where world leaders gathered to discuss the most pressing issues of our time. As Vanessa entered the building, she was struck by the gravity of the occasion. She had already done so much, but this moment felt like the pinnacle of everything she had worked for. The leaders of multiple countries were waiting for her in the main hall, all eager to hear her thoughts on diversity, inclusion, and the path forward. The weight of the task ahead pressed on her, but she welcomed it. She wasn't just representing herself. She was representing millions of people whose voices had been ignored for too long. When she stood before the assembly, the room fell silent. She had been given the floor, and the world was watching. Vanessa took a deep breath, steadied her nerves, and began. "The world we live in is divided," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We know this. We see it every day. But the question is not whether we see it. The question is, what are we going to do about it? For far too long, we have lived in systems that were built to exclude, to diminish, and to deny. The systems that keep people out of power, out of opportunity, out of education, and out of the right to simply exist with dignity. But it's time to change that. It's time to ensure that every person, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, has the same opportunities to thrive." Vanessa paused, allowing her words to sink in. She could feel the weight of the room's collective gaze. She knew the stakes had never been higher. "I stand here not just as a leader, but as a witness. I have seen firsthand the power of what happens when people come together to demand change. We have seen it in the corporate world. We've seen it in the streets. We've seen it in the laws that are starting to shift. But I also know that we are just getting started. The work ahead of us will be difficult. It will be uncomfortable. And it will take time. But I believe that we are at a moment in history where change is possible. Not just the change of policies or laws, but the change of hearts and minds. We are at the precipice of a global shift, a shift that will make our world one where everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from, will be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. But it will not happen overnight. It will take work. It will take all of us. The room remained silent, and Vanessa could feel the intensity of the moment. She had started a revolution, and now the world was beginning to recognize it. This is a global issue. The fight for equality is not confined to one country, one continent, or one community. It is a universal struggle, and it is one that we must all take part in. If we want to build a future where every person is valued, we must commit ourselves to creating systems that are truly inclusive, truly equitable. It is not enough to simply pass laws or put up policies. We need to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion are at the heart of every organization, every government, every institution. She paused again, her gaze sweeping over the room. She wasn't just speaking to the leaders in front of her. She was speaking to the world. We are no longer asking for equality. We are demanding it. We will not wait any longer for the world to change on its own. We will be the change, and it starts now. The room erupted into applause, but Vanessa's mind was already on the next step. This was a victory, but the work had only just begun. She would continue to fight, continue to push forward, and continue to inspire others to take up the mantle of leadership and change. The world was ready for something new, and Vanessa Clark was at the forefront of that change. Vanessa sat in her office late that night, looking out over the city skyline. The glow of the lights reflected in the windows, but her mind was far from the peaceful scene outside. She had come so far, her work had sparked a revolution, but it had only scratched the surface. As the world began to recognize the changes she had set in motion, Vanessa knew the real test was just beginning. Legislation had passed. Companies were beginning to embrace diversity and inclusion, and communities were standing together like never before. But the systemic inequalities that had plagued society for generations would not be eliminated overnight. The fight for equality was far from over, and Vanessa had no intention of stopping now. She was a force that had ignited something bigger than herself, but the path ahead was still filled with obstacles. She couldn't afford to become complacent. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from her team. "Vanessa, we have a meeting scheduled with the United Nations next week. It's a chance to discuss how we can take this global." Vanessa felt a surge of determination. She had been invited to speak at international platforms before, but this was different. The United Nations was the heart of global diplomacy, and the opportunity to be part of that conversation meant that her message was being heard worldwide. This was her chance to solidify the movement she had started, to ensure that the conversation about equality and justice moved beyond national borders. She couldn't pass it up. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Her team worked with experts from around the world, gathering data and proposals on how to create international standards for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Vanessa didn't want this to be just another conference. She wanted it to be a turning point in the global fight for equality. She needed to make sure the message was clear that the fight for justice and respect wasn't limited to one country or one industry, but was a global responsibility. When the day of the meeting arrived, Vanessa stood before a room filled with world leaders, diplomats, and advocates. The weight of the moment was not lost on her. This was it. This was her chance to truly affect global change. As she began to speak, her voice filled the room, steady and commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, the fight for equality is not confined to borders, religions, or cultures. It is a universal struggle. We all know that the systems of discrimination that have existed for centuries are still deeply rooted in many parts of the world. And while progress has been made, we are far from where we need to be. We must come together as a global community to ensure that every person, regardless of their race, gender, background, or circumstances, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. The room was silent as Vanessa spoke. She could feel the weight of their attention, and she didn't flinch. This wasn't just about passing another resolution or making another promise. It was about transforming the way the world viewed equality and justice. This is not a fight for a specific group or a specific region, she continued. This is a fight for humanity, and we have to ask ourselves, how will history remember us? Will it remember us as the generation that allowed injustice to thrive? Or will it remember us as the generation that rose up and demanded change? She paused, letting her words sink in. The impact was undeniable. Vanessa could see the leaders in the room nodding, exchanging glances. They were listening. I stand before you today not just as a leader, but as someone who believes that we can do better. We must do better. The systems of inequality that exist today have been built over centuries, but that does not mean they are invincible. It is up to us to dismantle them, to create a new foundation where everyone, everywhere, has the same opportunities to succeed. And that starts now. The applause was thunderous. Vanessa stood at the podium, her heart pounding. She had done it. Her message had been heard, and the world was ready to take the next step. As the meeting ended, the conversations continued. Vanessa could feel the shift happening. This wasn't just a conversation, it was the beginning of a new global commitment to fight for equality. She walked out of the room knowing that the work ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that she had ignited a fire that couldn't be put out. Vanessa had become a global leader in the fight for justice, but more than that, she had become the embodiment of what it meant to never give up on the pursuit of equality. The future was bright, and Vanessa knew that with each step, she was one step closer to a world where equality was not just a dream, but a reality. As Vanessa continued to travel the world, speaking to leaders, activists, and everyday people, the reality of the change she had started began to fully sink in. She had sparked a movement that transcended borders, a movement that was now being recognized as a global call for justice and equality. But with all of the praise and recognition came a heavy burden, one that Vanessa did not take lightly. The work was far from done, and she knew it. The fight for equality was ongoing, and she had only just begun to scratch the surface of the deep-rooted injustices that still persisted. The corporations and organizations she had helped reform were only the beginning. The real challenge was ensuring that the momentum continued, that the values of fairness, respect, and inclusion were instilled at every level of society. Vanessa's work now focused on building infrastructure for long-term change. She worked with governments to implement policies that ensured diversity and inclusion weren't just corporate buzzwords but were enshrined in law. She worked with schools to make sure that future generations were educated on the importance of equality, empathy, and leadership. She started initiatives that provided resources and support to underserved communities, so they could advocate for themselves and take part in the fight for equality. Yet, as she worked tirelessly to move the needle forward, she began to notice a shift in the way people viewed her. She wasn't just a leader anymore. She was now a symbol of something much bigger. She had become the face of a movement, the beacon of hope for people everywhere who had been marginalized, silenced, or told they were not enough. But with that level of recognition came intense scrutiny. People watched her every move, waiting for her to slip, to falter, to show weakness. It wasn't easy to constantly live under a microscope, but Vanessa understood that it was part of the price of leadership. As she prepared for a major speech in New York, she reflected on how far she had come. There was a time when she had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed when her dreams seemed too big, too far-fetched to ever come true. But now, here she was, standing on the edge of something much larger than herself. She had created a movement, and the world was listening. The night of the speech, the atmosphere in the room was electric. There was a sense of anticipation that filled the air, as though everyone present knew they were about to witness history in the making. Vanessa took the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. The audience was silent, waiting for her words. She stood for a moment, gathering herself, before speaking into the microphone. "We are at a crossroads," she began, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "The world we live in has made progress, yes, but we are still far from where we need to be. We've taken steps toward equality, but the journey is long. We are still fighting for basic rights that so many of us take for granted. There are still too many people who are left behind, who are told that they don't belong, who are denied the opportunity to succeed simply because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. This is not just a fight for some of us, it is a fight for all of us." The crowd remained silent, hanging on every word. Vanessa's presence was commanding, her words resonating deep within the hearts of those listening. "This is not just about the policies we put in place or the laws we pass," she continued. "It's about changing the way we think, the way we treat each other. It's about understanding that our differences are what make us stronger, not weaker. We cannot move forward until we make sure that every person, no matter who they are, has the same chance to thrive. And that is not just a corporate responsibility, it is a human responsibility." The room erupted in applause, but Vanessa wasn't finished. "We cannot rest. We cannot stop. Because when we stop, we let the systems of injustice creep back in. We let them grow and take hold once again. We must stay vigilant. We must stay united. And most importantly, we must stay committed to the fight for equality, not just for us, but for everyone." The applause grew louder, but Vanessa was already thinking ahead. She knew that the work wasn't over. The movement she had started would continue long after she was gone. It had to. And as she walked off the stage, the weight of her mission remained with her. She had sparked a global movement, but now it was time for others to pick up the torch. Vanessa had done her part, but the future was in the hands of the people, and with that, she felt a deep sense of pride. The work she had started would continue to grow, and she was confident that the next generation of leaders would carry the fight for equality forward, just as she had done. The world was changing, and there was no turning back. As the years passed, Vanessa's influence continued to grow, but her focus remained on the future, on the ongoing work that needed to be done. She had achieved more than she could have ever imagined when she first began, but she knew that the fight for equality and justice was never truly finished. It was a long, continuous journey, one that required constant effort, persistence, and dedication. Vanessa had built a legacy, but she wasn't content with simply looking back at her accomplishments. She was determined to ensure that the work would carry on long after she was no longer leading the charge. She watched with pride as the next generation of leaders took up the mantle. Young activists, business leaders, and change-makers from all walks of life were now taking the lessons she had taught and applying them in their own communities. Vanessa had not only changed the world, she had sparked a movement that was now self-sustaining, growing and evolving with each passing day. The world she had fought for was becoming a reality, and she could see it in the faces of those who followed in her footsteps. They had been inspired by her strength, her courage, and her unwavering belief in the power of change. She had shown them that one person could make a difference, that one voice could lead to a chorus of others demanding a better world. It wasn't just about laws or policies, it was about people, about their ability to come together, to fight for each other, and to create a future where everyone had an equal opportunity to thrive. The work wasn't easy, and the setbacks were frequent, but Vanessa had become a symbol of hope for millions. She had broken down barriers, and now it was time for others to continue breaking new ground. As she stood in her office one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, Vanessa felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had given everything she had to this cause, and though there was still work to be done, she knew that the world was in a better place because of it. She had lived through the adversity, fought the battles, and overcome the obstacles, but now it was no longer about her. It was about the countless others who had joined her in the fight, the individuals whose lives had been changed by the movement she had helped build. They were the true heroes of this story. And as Vanessa looked toward the future, she knew that the next chapter would be written by them. She had ignited the spark, and now it was up to others to carry it forward. With the world watching, Vanessa Clark had achieved the impossible. She had created a world where equality, justice, and respect were no longer optional. They were the foundation of everything. The battle was far from over, but the fight was no longer a solitary one. The world had changed, and it was only going to keep evolving, growing, and becoming more inclusive, more equitable, and more just. Vanessa had done her part, and now the future was in the hands of those who would continue the work. As she walked away from her office for the final time, ready to pass the baton to the next generation, Vanessa knew one thing for sure. The fight for equality would never stop, but with each victory, the world was becoming a better place for everyone.